friends. I welcome you all on behalf of the director and on behalf of the faculty and staff of CSDS. A very warm welcome first to Dhirubai, who we have seen after a long time, and to Ashis who doesn't like book launches, and to Lord Bhikhu, Parekh and Peter, but all of you. As I look around the room, it looks like a reunion of the extended family that CSDS has been. And a lot of you are fans of Dhirubai Saint. We were interviewing Ashis recently for a film that promo film that we are making, and he kept talking about those old days when, the oral culture of CSDS was a dominant feature, a fraction of which found its way into the print as well. And we are thankful to Peter for putting it all together under one cover for students, for their convenience and also for posterity. So without much ado, thanks Peter for all the labor, thanks to the publishers for publishing it in record time, and thanks to all of you for coming here on a very short notice. Ashis, I hand over the proceedings to you. You are the chair.
That sounds respectable. Well, welcome again on my behalf too. This is a very special occasion for us. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only book of Professor Sheth which is being released today. And I presume this also will be his last. There was another book which saw light of the day about, I guess, some roughly 35-40 years ago. But its release was celebrated more abroad than at the center, because it was a joint or collective effort, a four-country study of political values, comparative study of political values. The first such effort mounted anywhere in the world, particularly the first such effort in what was then East Europe. It was very difficult to mount a study of this kind. So I welcome Dhirubai specifically. He has not been coming to the center for quite a while. I'm not sitting very close to him, as you can see, because I have a bad case of cold, and I don't want to gift it to him on this auspicious day. We shall start by a brief statement, first by the editor of the book.
Editor.
I hope by brief, Ashis has given me at least 15 minutes. Yes. I'd like to also begin by thanking Bhikhu for agreeing to launch the book at very short notice. He happens to be here on his annual research work in India. And when I phoned and asked him if he would be here, he immediately agreed to come. He's come all the way from Baroda to be with us to launch the book. This occasion is really a celebration, not just a book discussion, but a celebration of Dhirubai's work and Dhirubai's scholarship. Let me say a little bit about the book project. When I undertook to work with the material that Dhirubai had collected over half a century, I thought it was going to be an easy job of just compiling the articles and putting them together in some kind of sequence. But very soon I realized Dhirubhai's work is not that easy to compile. You have to begin a conversation with it. You have to interrogate it. You have to not just question the work, but question your own frameworks within which you're conducting the dialogue. And very soon, from being an editor, I became a kind of it became a tutorial of reading through and working with Dhirubhai's work. It was a cumbersome process, and part of that process was a conversation with Surabhi, who was always in the room adjudicating my disputes with Dhirubhai. There were many disputes, I can assure you. This book went through ups and downs as Dhirubhai and I disagreed on sequencing, on selection, on interpretation, etc. And it was always Surabhi who helped us. So she's the third author of this manuscript, and we miss her today. So this is also a celebration of her intellectual engagement with Dhirubhai and with these writings. The content of the book is varied, and when you look through the table of contents, you get a sense of the huge range of work, of issues on which Dhirubhai thought and wrote, on which he contributed his significant readings of these complex transformations that were taking place in India. He always liked the S to transformations. It wasn't a single transformation, it was a layered transformation. He always insisted that it was transformations, transitions, and that was something that I learned from the project. I want to basically comment on the book at three levels. I've given, there's a detailed introduction to the book, so I hope that when the book is available in an Indian print, it will be read. But I want to begin by saying that I see this book as a great companion to Rajni Kothari's politics in India. I hope it will, over time, acquire that kind of significance, because it is rich in insight. It's what I call a valuable khazana of hypothesis for the discipline in political science and the social sciences. So it needs to be mined. It needs to be opened up for the discipline. Now I say this because how then should one read Dhirubhai's work? There are three axes around which I've tried to make sense of the writings. And as I said, we've only selected 15 articles from a large number. We've clustered them in a certain way. We have quarreled over everything, including the title. I'd like to begin. One of the axes to understand Dhirubhai's work is to understand why different communities of scholars don't see him as one of their own. The secularists are unhappy with him, thinking that there's a sort of hidden sympathy for the other side. The developmental policy people are unhappy with him because he's critical of their position. Mainstream political parties are unhappy with him because he takes a strong position against family and politics. He's critical of the existing social science frameworks. And he's sympathetic to movements, he's sympathetic to doing social sciences in the bhasas. You find, so how do you understand this body of writing? And I think to do that you have to go to his biography. You have to understand Dhirubhai's biography in terms of his childhood in his village in Gujarat when the national movement was taking place. He was a young boy. He was barely out of his 10 years, 11 years old, and there was the excitement of the national movement in the air, in which he participated on the sidelines. He heard about it at home through gossip. He heard about it in the village through gossip. He participated in the Seva Dal and made fun of the RSS shakhas on the other side of the river. All of which, in a sense, contributed to his sense that something great was in the air. And so from the village he gained the sense of social rules, social relationships, which runs right through, infuses his work. From the community, he got a sense of identity, the inside and the outside. From the region, he gained a sense of the cosmopolitan, the larger project of modernity. And then, of course, from the nation, he gained the sense of the larger historical transformations taking place. Now, one thematic that runs through Dhirubhai's work is the relationship between the backward and, interestingly, the opposite of that is not forward. For Dhirubhai, it's backward. So whether he's looking at caste, whether he's looking at region, whether he's looking at Adivasis, whether he's looking at development, there's the backward. And the opposite of that is the modern. So this modern, this thing called the modern, which inspires his work, is at least in my reading, this is my reading of Dhirubhai. I suddenly realize I'm giving you the impression that I was speaking on his behalf. Not. So it's the backward and the modern. And the second major theme that runs through his thing is the concern with the denial of rights. So whether he was involved in the pioneer movement, whether he was involved with lots of the opposition to the emergency, etc., it was this rights discourse which is so important. And particularly when it came down to marginal groups, whether it's Adivasis who were displaced with large development projects in Singrauli, or whether it is Dalit atrocities against Dalits, it is that question of the denial of rights which runs through his work. Now you can see these writings as a very rich ethnography of India. But I wanted to see it, and that's where I had my first big fight with Dhirubhai, as suggesting that his work constitutes the appropriate level of theory. Now that word appropriate level of theory, I'm sure is going to put everybody's back up. What do you mean by appropriate? What is an appropriate level of theory? So I wanted to call it a political theory of India. He quarreled with me, and finally we decided to make it the subtitle of the book. It's called A Theory of Indian Politics. It's not in the main title, but the word theory had to be there, and I needed Ashis to adjudicate that dispute. Now, why do I think that Dhirubhai's work constitutes a theory of Indian politics? And why is it an appropriate level of theory? So in a sense, one wants to position this book as a critique of existing and established theories, and a critique of the discipline of political science as well. He never intended that, but that's the way, as editor, I would like to suggest. Because I see in it, there are multiple theoretical cells. He's an ethnographer, he's a political economist, he's a political sociologist, he's a constitutionalist. So each of these domains he's engaging with. His framing of the problem, in a sense, is free of the Orientalist framing, and I will show you in some of the hypotheses that he has selected. His work is rich in description, so it's very close to the problem, but it's also very critically distant. So, because you're getting a sense of trends and dynamics at a certain level of abstraction. And he can therefore dialogue with the nativist, with the cosmopolitan, with the activist, and with the intellectual. And I think, so therefore, all these things, I may be overselling the book, but I'm doing it deliberately because that's the only way in which we can have a robust criticism. And Dhirubhai thrives on criticism. So if you want him to thrive, please criticize him. Now, central to this whole exercise was his deep belief that knowledge is co-produced. It's not just you don't just sit in CSDS and think through all these problems. So therefore, the Lokayan experiment was very much an experiment of the co-production of knowledge, academics and activists in conversation continuously. And he genuinely believed this. And you see this in his work. So when I say it's an appropriate level of theory, I think it answers three of the questions that any such claim would make. Why has he selected a set of issues? How has he formulated the problem? How has he positioned himself against existing theories? And in all three levels, there's a very clear position that Dhirubhai takes. In fact, he has what I call a theory of democracy, and as luck would have it, I've actually found a passage where he gives us his definition, and that's the only long quote I'm going to give you. So what is democracy in Dhirubhai's work? And this is where, I'm reading it out because I want us to appreciate the many layers readings of India, theoretically, which you can find in Dhirubhai. So what is democracy? I quote, democracy may be said to be a model of deliberate imperfection, a model that tolerates loose ends in the system. Democracy recognizes the multiplicity of possible courses open to the system at any given particular point in time. It presumes a society that allows various legitimation processes to test themselves out on the ground through critical analysis and through real-life conflict, struggles, and integrative movements of ideas and actions. And if you begin to engage in that simple 8-line definition, you begin to see a wealth of possibilities. And it actually incorporates a lot of the issues that we are struggling with when we are trying to understand Indian democracy. So that's the second major axis with which I think I'd like to play, that his work constitutes an appropriate level of theory. The third, and this runs through, and this is something that I have certainly learned from Dhirubhai, because his work poses two questions of the discipline, of the social sciences. What is democracy doing to India? Which is the first question we all ask, and then we go about detailing what it is doing to the environment, to groups, to parties, to states. What is democracy doing to India? Is the standard dominant trope. And he answers that question as well. But he reverses the question. What is India doing to democracy? So not only is it a description of the transformations that are taking place, what is democracy doing to India, but these transformations challenge the dominant and established conceptual viewing of process. What is India doing to democracy? So in what is democracy doing to India, you'll have a wonderful account of, say, for example, I've listed 5 or 6 hypotheses in the text, and that's my selection, but I suggest anyone who reads the book can find their own 5 or 6, and maybe 10 or whatever. It's rich in hypothesis offerings. So he has a theory of elites, for example, where he sees a contestation between elites who speak in English and elites who speak in the Bhasas. And each of them, therefore, produces a different logic of transformation. And sometimes there's a tension between these two logics. And so the English walas want to globalize, the Bhasa walas want to consolidate the regions and the politics in the region, and maybe even anti-globalization, but they're both members of the elite process. Or for example, when he sees reservations as a bloodless revolution, which produces a breach in the ritual system of caste. If caste is essentially a ritual system, reservations has actually breached it. What is democracy doing to India? Now reverse it. Take reservations itself. He comes up with a fascinating insight that one of the unintended consequences of reservation is secularism. Now, to my mind, nobody in the secularism debate has made that connection. Reservations has actually strengthened the secular edifice of India, because it has produced identity politics, and therefore the kind of majoritarian politics that the BJP is trying to do will always have to face this problem of the identity politics that has emerged because of reservations. Or take, for example, the theory of representation that emerges in his work. Now, for those of us, representation is done in terms of elections, selecting who's going to represent you. But he makes a very strong case for giving equal legitimacy to representation that comes from groups in civil society. He doesn't use the word civil society, he calls it non-party political formation, which is, I think, a richer one. They represent through issues. So it may be a one-person organization, it may be a 10-person organization, but the very fact that they enter the public discourse with a set of issues which they place on the table for state attention, policy attention, transformation, etc. It's representation. So in a sense, representation in India comes not just from the formal institutional system, which is very critical of, but also from this non-formal party, non-party political formations, which is outside the formal institutional system, but it constitutes a theory of representation. I could go on and on. I've spoken too long. So I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to work and bring out this book, to have my quarrels with Dhirubhai through which I learned, through having Surabhi Ben adjudicate that, and often in that adjudication I benefited from her wonderful hospitality, wonderful evenings in Shimla and in Delhi. And I hope that this book will now begin to have the impact in the discipline, in the classroom that I believe it deserves. Thank you.
My COPD gets aggravated, but I like to say so many things, so let me see. First of all, I think this is an unprecedented event in the center, because this is not the first book that has come out of the center. There have been books, and if you had such occasions and celebrations, then celebrating somebody like Ashis and these books, center would go into deficit of so that's not such a big thing, but for me, it is, I see not just love for all of you, but a keen recognition that this needs to be celebrated and portrayed, because this is the one and only book, and I am not sure whether next will be coming. So I am very happy about this, and thank you, all of you. About the book, I have tried to what I call de-academize. That does not mean non-academic, but the academized discourse is full of isolations. Anything that we do not know becomes summarization, like demonization and everything. And most of the time, some of our writings seek shortcut through pretentious academic kind of language. I think there is a need to find that middle path, because it is social science. So a layman, a layperson should be able to, sort of participate in that production of knowledge and create his own images. I can give you several examples what happens when this happens, and how knowledge sort of loses its kind of a mystique and becomes largely a common sense. And that's how, there are dangers of ideologies of when social science becomes common sense and all that. But even then, the level of discourse and the wider democratic understanding of the people, I think, expands, minimizing this gap between social sciences and laymen. Now this may sound very, very curious, but I don't mind the gap if it is social science, but not something, say, like, take a concept like secularism. Now I think we don't have secularism. It's yet, what we have is a kind of minoritism at one hand and majoritarianism at the other hand. So the secularism issue in India is majoritarian versus minoritarian. It has nothing to do with the classical sense of secularism when it is violated even in state policies and in politics. And then we sometimes believe that this is peculiarly Indian because we are secular in a special way. I have my problems with that. I think the domain of secular and domain of citizenship have got to overlap certainly. Here the citizenship domain is sort of fragmented into many identities, which is okay. Pluralism I love, but pluralism is not pluralism in true sense. I think it is many communalisms. If you content analyze the politics of communities and their leadership and their goals and all that, I cannot celebrate it as pluralism. It is multiple communalism in most of the cases. When one can disagree with that, we can discuss that. But what is it that makes something communal? And that is the claim, I suppose, of a very special truth of one's being, one's doing and all that. In the end of the day, the multiplication of all these compromises makes secularism a very dim kind of reality. That's I thought I would like to say. Secondly, yes, this is an unprecedented event in the sense that the book is by D.M. Sheth. Nobody expected, including me. So, that's it. Thank you.
May I now request Professor Bhikhu Parekh to release the book. On behalf of all of us, so we don't have to stand and smile for the photographer.
It's available on 20% discount as e-book. As e-book.
Yes, I think the popular demand is strong. Professor Nandy is going to
Maybe request you to say a few words on the book.
All complaint. When I came, I met the lady who represented the publishers, and she tells me that the book is priced at 120 euros, which I roughly calculated as 90 pounds, which is 8,500 rupees. Now, very much as I love you, and as all everybody does, you are sufficiently money-minded, money to realize that not all of us are going to part with that kind of money to buy even one of the finest books. So I hope there will be some way in which the publishers, whose representative is here, would consider reducing the price, either for everybody or at least for the students. Because ultimately the destiny of this book is to be read by. I think they are going to have a proper pricing through this distributed. Right. That's what I'm doing. That is
Southeast Asia.
yes. So what would the price be? What would the price be? 850. That's bearable. That's bearable. That's bearable. Anything higher, I think over 1,000 would be a little too much. So it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be associated with an event like this, where we launch the book of one of the finest theorists of India, who also happens to be a very dear friend. And I remember long years ago, I think it was in 1989, when I published my second book on Gandhi and India. I dedicated it to CSDS, which is where most of it was written, and to Dhirubhai in particular, who represented for me the inspiring spirit of CSDS. So I want to reaffirm it on this occasion what I did at the time, which is to say how much you have been an influence on many of us, almost everyone here, either directly by personal content or through your writing. So Dhirubhai, thank you for being who you are. Now I have been asking myself, how do I place Dhirubhai? I'm not going to talk about the book, because you haven't had a chance to read it, and we have had some
fairly exhaustive summaries by Peter. I think just as we talk about pluralizing the good life, we must think of pluralizing the academic life. And academics can respond to their work in several ways, of which three are quite common. One is there are people who think and think and think, but never publish anything. Socrates is one example. Or Mota, whom Dilrubai thanks in the book and who influenced both him and me and Rajni. Rajni in fact dedicated his first book to him. They're like this. I mean, like Penelope's web. They will think and produce a theory or some kind of theory in the night, and in the morning unravel it because some further thoughts had developed. So people who keep thinking and who even think that to have a thought is to arrest the process of thinking and is a betrayal of thinking. And in that sense, the theory would be a double betrayal. Because thought betrays theory or thinking, and the theory distorts thought. So there are people who think but don't publish anything. Then there are secondly, and they are just as important as the others, but this is a way of being academics. Then there are people who would largely think in terms of essays. These are essay people, as I call them. Think of Azeb Alem, think of Stuart Hall, or think of John Rawls before he published The Theory of Justice. A man of substantial essays, all of them very carefully thought out, each one nevertheless self-complete, pointing beyond itself but still defining itself in its own terms. So there are people who write essays. And finally there are people who write books, some good, some even better. and these books are the ones through the medium of which they influence others. Now if you think of academic life as articulated in this way, there is no hierarchy. One wouldn't say that somebody who writes a big tome is necessarily a better academic than somebody who just thinks and doesn't write. I would have placed Dilrubai amongst one of the finest essayists. He's not just a thinker, he also writes essays, but he's not a big book man, and thank God for that. And because in the academic world, you judge a man by the big book that he has written. I mean, I remember asking a lot of people when I first introduced to them, look, in order to be familiar with your thought, what is your big book that I should read? And I've only met one man so far saying, look, I don't have a big book. I mean, everyone says the book he has written is a big book. So I think in Dilrubai's case, he's a man of essays, very substantial essays, deeply reflective, all closely connected, each one complete but also pointing beyond itself, and moving from one area to another as the logic of his interest dictate. Rethinking, revising, reaffirming the essays that he has written. And he has covered a lot of ground. He has written about democracy, which is what the book is about, secularism, language policy, I think something we haven't touched upon, but he has some wonderful things to say. I mean, I learned a great deal about the way in which Hindi and English and others have been deeply influenced by the democratic politics of India. Reservations, nationalism, caste, I mean, think of many of these areas where his mark has been deep and substantial. There are others which he hasn't fully covered, and I hope he will, such as, for example, the judiciary in India, which is in the news, or the quality of public deliberation, or the media, or shifts in foreign policy. But these are things that Dilrubai will one day turn to, and even if he doesn't, I think he has done enough to see him as one of the finest theorists of post-independence. And he should be seen not only as a theorist, but also as what is clumsily called a public intellectual. I don't like the term because I don't understand what is a private intellectual. But a public intellectual in the sense of applying his theoretical insights to the understanding of day-to-day problems. And I think that again is an area through which he has influenced a lot of people at a number of levels. Now this book, and I think I couldn't resist saying at least a few things about the book, which I had the privilege of reading, but I don't want to talk about the book itself. I want to talk about the large issues that the book raises. The book is called At Home with the Democracy, A Theory of Indian Politics. And I was struck by the fact that it uses two words, democracy and then the subtitle politics. And I asked myself, what is the relation between democracy and politics, and why is the theory of Indian politics, subtitle, has as its title, At Home with Democracy. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because what happens is that Indian politics has been so deeply shaped by the practice of democracy that it simply can't be understood without this. And the question to ask therefore is, what has democracy done to India? What has India done to democracy? And equally importantly, what kind of democracy did we opt for? I mean, democracy is not one thing. There are different kinds of democracy, different types of democracy. At independence, as a result of our independence struggle, what was our thinking about democracy, and what kind of democracy did we opt for? And I think here I just want to advance one or two very broad hypotheses. I think when one thinks of democracy, one thinks of the West, because obviously we have been influenced by the West. And in the West we have two different traditions. There is the democratic tradition which begins in Athens, in the West, and there is the republican tradition which begins in Rome. Because before Rome developed republic, there was no republic. So you have the democratic tradition and you have the republican tradition, both structured differently, both competing and at the same time combining in certain ways. And India called itself not just a democracy, not just a republic, but a democratic republic. And that itself is very striking, because in the Objectives Resolution in 1948, Panditji had used the word India will be a democracy, but no reference to republic. And when he was asked why not, he said democracy includes republic. When the first draft of the Constitution came, it used the word republic, but not democracy. And Panditji said, why not democracy? He said it's included in republic. Panditji was capable of saying many things, including many things. The final draft says India is a democratic republic. Both words appear. Why? It's a long story. I have written about it. Many of you have written about it, so I shan't bore you with details. But just being a republic was not enough. India had to be a democratic as opposed to an undemocratic republic, which republic was during many years, many decades in the history of Rome. But nor was it going to be just a democracy, it was going to be a democratic republic. Well, anyway, there are these two traditions that come down to us, and when we think of democracy alone, we have the Athenian democracy, which lasted a few decades, then disappeared, subterranean existence, and it emerges in the 17th and 18th century in the form of liberal democracy. And the liberal democracy in the sense of a liberalized democracy, democracy articulated within the framework of liberalism. So liberalism is its starting point and its end point. Liberalism provides the theory of the state. Democracy provides the theory of government. And then liberal democracy is defined, articulated in liberal terms. And if you take liberalism, what are those terms? Basically three ideas. I mean, the idea of individualism, having rights or private space which is protected by the state, and representation. These are the three central ideas of liberal democracy, none of which appears in Athenian democracy. And the question I think that's worth thinking about, and which Dhirubhai has hinted at, Peter elaborated, is this very complex notion of representation. What is representation? Central to liberal democracy, and yet never fully articulated. As someone said, I go into a polling booth as an act of freedom, and I command with a master in the form of an elected representative. The question therefore is, what is it that a representative does? Who does he represent? What does he represent? My views, my interest, me? What does it mean to represent me as a whole? So I think there are these complexities about the notion of representation. And when you combine with democracy, it can be understood in one of two ways. Either you can think of representatives elected by the people, and then you have a government by the representatives, for the representatives, of the representatives. Or you can think of this is representative government. Or you can think of representative democracy as democracy providing the wider framework and the representatives being embedded in it. Now when that happens, politics is no longer the monopoly of representatives. and elected representatives do not have the monopoly of representation. These are the two fundamental ideas which appear in the book, and I think worth stressing, that politics is not simply defined by the closed world of representatives, and elected representatives are not the only people who represent. One can also represent without being elected. But once so they are what I think Peter called the de facto or effective representatives. But then the question is, if you have this kind of representative democracy, where you have people who are effective representatives, de facto representatives, without being elected representatives, what is the relation between the two? Can the de facto representatives say, well, we represent people and therefore in their name we will do something? To which the elected representatives would say, no, but you don't represent because you don't have electoral legitimacy. And I think that is a tension at the heart of representative democracy, which comes up in a country like India in a big way. It also comes up in the UK, the country I know the best. But nevertheless, I think it comes up here in a very big way. That representatives doing certain things and claiming electoral legitimacy. As different from that, the activists, the grassroots people and movement-oriented people think, no, this is right because we have popular legitimacy. Because when you have people engaged in active movement, it's not just people acting through representatives, it is people reclaiming the authority and saying, you have been speaking for us, now we want to speak ourselves. But then how much can they speak? What can they speak? And how do you establish a relation between people as a whole and representative institutions? So I think there are some of these ideas where one can go on, and I should stop there. But just one notion I think that comes up here is if you look at our constitution, and this tension remains unresolved, but if you look at our constitution and you ask yourself, what did the founding fathers, uncles, aunts and mothers of our republic think of representation? What kind of people did they think would be the representatives? Would be elected as representatives? And almost inevitably they thought of future representatives in their own image. They thought of public-spirited people who only thought of national interest, and they thought that these people would be debating the affairs of the country. But sadly, things haven't quite worked out that way. And the question therefore is, what do we do? And this is where I think what Dhirubhai has said in the book, a good deal to say, a lot of interest. And rather than preempt his answers or sit in judgment on them, I want to commend them to you and simply end by saying it's a fine contribution to a theory of not just Indian politics, but a theory of modern, contemporary politics. And it tells us how at the heart of politics, this tension between elected representatives, institutionally functioning, and unelected representatives, where people freely express themselves. The tension between the two is the heart, in many ways, of modern politics, including Trump and lots of other people. Thank you.
Discussion. So please feel free to raise questions or comment.
Question about it's a question about it's a question that comes from just the way Can I just be really loud?
Yeah. Hold it closer to your.
Closer to the.
That's all.
The question. See, the question that I have is this: that over the past few years, and with the changing idea of how we will be, in a sense, the thing moving away from administration according to the law to governance according to perceived ends. The idea of democracy seems to be changing, where it is just about putting people in positions of power, and then the government will tell us, and we have to be obedient citizens. Otherwise, the state can't carry on. Government can't carry on with its existence and its functions. There is a mix in the way in which it is talked about. There's a mix of paternalism. There is a kind of idea that if there is no control, you can't carry on with the country. The idea of large populations is being used to say that you have to have less rights because there is more population, and that if you have to have certain kinds of rights, you have to give up certain other kinds of rights. For instance, civil liberties and the civil right even to speak and to participate has to be tempered because you have to get other kinds, if you want other kinds of rights to be delivered to a larger section of people. So there is a whole complex that's coming in. I personally find that the idea of technology has gone and queered it up even more, because the way the state seems to be looking at the people is that the state doesn't trust the people anymore. So it seems like an inversion to me. From our testing the trust of the state, it's the state looking at whether it will trust the people. I'm just wondering what it is doing to the idea of democracy at all, and how do we recapture any of that imagination?
जिस तरह से ओबीसी गुजरात में अभी काम किया तो हार्दिक पटेल का, जिग्नेश का डिस्कोर्स, तो उसमें काफी अट्रैक्टिव लगता है आज के समय में, इतिहास को भूल के अगर देखा जाए तो। और जिस तरह की स्ट्रॉन्ग न्यू एंड समटाइम्स अनरियल मिथिकल स्ट्रॉन्ग सेंस ऑफ बाउंड्रीज बनाई जा रही हैं, लेकिन जो अब तक इनविजिबल, जैसे आप किसी गांव के बाहर बोर्ड लगा होगा तो ये क्षत्रियों का गांव है, और चाहे वो क्षत्रिय 5% ही हो उस गांव में, तो उस समय की प्रतिक्रिया में आज बहुत सी पहचाने, सिर्फ दलितों की नहीं, हिंदुओं की भी, जिस तरह से ब्रिटिश इंडिया में मेलों में हिंदू देवी देवताओं का मजाक क्रिश्चियन मिशनरीज वो ठेला लगा के लगाते थे और उस तरह का साहित्य बांटते थे, तो तरह तरह की सब जातियों में और सब वर्गों में ऐसी आइडेंटिटीज थी जो सप्रेस थी, और आज जब वो खड़ी हो रही हैं और उनके लिए गांधी जैसा कोई लार्जर डिस्कोर्स नहीं है, तो वो कम्युनल दिख रही हैं, क्योंकि उनमें एक तरह का अतिवाद है। तो इस बारीकी को मुझे उम्मीद है कि आपने अपनी किताब में लिया होगा, लेकिन यहाँ ऐसे कहने में अच्छा भी लगता है और परेशानी भी होती है।
Mine is not so much a question as because it is a celebration of Dhirubhai and his work and life, I just wanted to make one proposal, maybe for Peter, but maybe for all of us. I think, let me illustrate what I want to say with something I have been very acutely aware of and learned through my interactions with him. Not just as a question of, as a theorist of Indian democracy, a theorist of politics and so on, but in fact when we started our teaching program here in CSDS, Researching the Contemporary, one of the first discussions we had on the question of the contemporary, I remember one passing comment by Dhirubhai, but which eventually actually became an important lodestar for us, so to speak, was his idea of contemporaneizing as a method. How do we relate to pasts, to intellectual traditions, to pasts of societies which we do not consider as our contemporary, but is there a way of taking away from specific historical contexts into thinking of ideas and intellectual traditions as if they were living, as if they had something to say to our present? And I think I have personally definitely gained from it, but my point in raising this question is also that I believe there is a lot in various writings of Dhirubhai's on which some work needs to be further done, in the sense he won't do it now. And I think, Peter, if you could take it up as a part 2 of your project, we could think of it. I'm willing to volunteer my little bit of contribution to it.
Basically, we have seen our democracy starting from socialist democratic structure to transforming to liberalist democratic structure. Like we have planning commission and it is dissolved now. So I have a question: what kind of type of democracy will be best suited in our current scenario? And as in comparison with the communist governments in state like Tripura, in which we have a highest level of HDI, Human Development Index, how can you relate to that? Thanks.
You know, I have been one of the earliest beneficiaries of Dhirubhai's company, intellectual guidance, and there was a time nothing I wrote which got out unless he had read it first. So we are in the celebration mood in the company of Dhirubhai, so I want to be part of that. Now, the most interesting, and I think Peter has captured it in the presentation, the most interesting thing is that about his theory of politics, not just Indian politics, Peter, his theory of politics. Politics conceptualized as institutions, movements, and ideas including culture. And at a time when institutionalism was the fashion, he was the political sociologist. At a time when political sociology was the fashion, he was the political economist. At a time when political economy was the fashion, he was the cultural theorist. Not only Ashis Nandy, also Dhirubhai. Okay? And so this composite notion that power and freedom, relations, operations, dimensions have this integrality of institutions, movements, and ideas and cultures, and none of which can be underestimated. And everything has to be dissected, pluralized, everything, all these dimensions, and historicized, and the dynamics. And you make a formulation, he will give you a qualification. He will contest. And that is the beauty of this place. That has been the beauty of this place. And from this great team of Rajani to now. And so and therefore, Peter, I will go a step further. It's not what India did to democracy and democracy did to India. What experiences like India's, and this applies to all countries, this is the general theory, what experiences, historical, contemporary experiences due to ideas and formulations in general. They are not deductive, they are not derivative to a relativist cultural or geographical situation. But this is that ideas continue to evolve in practice, not just empirical geographical practice of the time. In other words, on the theory of evolution of ideas, on the theory of politics, on the theory of democracy as Swaraj or self-determination or self-realization of individuals, groups, and regions, and not just the American thing. And so I think a theory of politics and a theory of democracy that arises from Dhirubhai's both essays and action. I think those dialogues, those conversations. The other day we had the Ranveer Singh volume out, and Manindra has an article on Ranveer Singh's classes and anecdotes. I think Dhirubhai's anecdotes will be a volume by itself. I think those of us who have been beneficiaries for 50 years of those anecdotes. I mean, we have many descriptions of Dhirubhai. I don't want to repeat them. but that itself will compose the real Sheth theory of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nandy. I'm sure this must be there in the book. I'm yet to naturally read it, but if I could invite a comment on this very serious issue, this extraordinary situation where we are not only seeing the rise of the right, but a collapse of the left. That is the more worrying side. And even more worrying, a very deep institutional crisis. The Supreme Court, what's happening in the Supreme Court, the RBI, the universities, the exam systems. Now, in this light, are we looking at activists only challenging the state, or this institutional crisis also, and also some kind of accountability and audit system for themselves? Do we have that in place? Oxfam.
Anyone wants to respond to that challenge? Otherwise, we will wind up this.
One level there is a paradigm. Implicit or explicit, whether you like it or not. And through that paradigm, and you can discover, you talk of one or two institutions. But in that paradigmatic sense, the classification of institutions on the criteria of democracy will be more of a general but important nature. The deeper institutional studies take care of different other things also, which I don't have done it in my work, except for one, I suppose, the study of Honorary or something, where I've tried to talk about the law and the lawyers. But right, I think if the focus is on institutions, then we have to go and work beyond general idea of democracy. Because the problem is, let me put it as something in mind. The overall general idea of democracy, when we talk of institution, is only derivatively used. That has prevented us from really identifying different kind of democratic thought and behavior, which you find in a study of institutions. How democratic is CSDS, or how authoritarian it is, becomes a valid question when it comes to an institution. And in that process, so all that I'm trying to say is that specific empirical studies of institutions are far and few in between. I think we need more of that.
We break for it. Come.
We're waiting for your wisdom.
My wisdom, no. I think spare them that. I can. Huh? Let me be very brief and very direct. I came under the thrall of these two Gujarati Banias 50 years ago. And as a Bengali Babu, brought up in an entirely different cultural milieu, I must say the shock was enormous. First of all, both of them were the first graduates in their family. Now, in my family, whatever I did, I was found wanting intellectually. My mother and aunts were brilliant students. My brothers were brilliant. And I had a terrible time always being compared to their academic achievements. Now I found that this might have many disadvantages for Rajni Kothari and D.L. Sheth. But I came to notice that they were unburdened in a fashion which I could never hope to be. And I suspect that here was a different way of looking at knowledge, where the authorities and the existing reference groups did not matter at all. Our discussions were invariably free-floating. It is not that, I mean, one thing I must be clear, that occasionally we did have a book launch, and it cost us a good bottle of scotch, that's all. No, and it invariably ended in a fight, because all of us would shout at the top of our voice and arguing for our individual positions. But I did notice that whereas I would be tempted often to supply examples from different academic backgrounds or different academic sources or intellectuals, academic intellect, Dhirubhai and Rajni will go directly to the issue, often without any reference whatsoever. So if you push them very hard, they might say, you might find, but it's very casual about it. They did not matter. And that freedom I came to envy very much. I think the clue to the creative thrust of the Center for the Study of Developing Society as a team was that it did not demand from you only the skills of an academic. It demanded from you, in addition to it, a responsibility as an intellectual. I think Bhikhu is right. You don't have to specify and call an intellectual public. An intellectual is by definition public. By definition public. His job is to provide, however tentative, a response to the immediate political circumstances and challenges, knowing fully well that you might have to modify it, change it, and so on and so forth. Time waits for none, not even for your theories. It is this distinction between the academic and the intellectual which has, I think, made the center what it is, given it the confidence of grappling with issues which otherwise I think we were often not equipped to do in the short notice in the way we thought we would do. Our response to the emergency was a very good example of it. None of us had previously worked in the area of authoritarianism. I too have read about it. That's about all. But that is about, but each of us responded to it directly. They produced work which was found relevant, which did make an intervention in the political climate of the day, and we are very proud of it. That is a different way. I mean, just now somebody mentioned that the most tragic thing is the collapse of the left. I would like to remind him that there were basically major flaws in the way the left self-defined. They self-defined themselves as academics. They are schools or sub-schools of radicalism made very little sense to the people around them. I think what we needed is somebody like A.K. Gopalan the old communist leader, who once said, "I have not read a word of Marx, because if I read Marx, I will not understand it. But I am a Marxist." I think that confidence of a different kind, that kind confidence did not, it was missing in the left. They didn't have the capacity even to include within the left other kinds of intellectual exercises which now would be differentiated from orthodox Marxism only as a means of hair splitting.
That came from Europe. That strength came from Europe, Marxism.
Yeah. So I want to leave this thought with you, that somewhere our concept of knowledge is not sufficiently dialogical. We did try to make something out of it. We did establish it as a dialogical center. Whether we called it so or not, I don't know. I don't remember. But I would suppose it to be now. Because this is ultimately also a dialogical civilization. And I like to believe that in this civilization, the attraction of democracy can only be because it is a dialogical process itself. It is a dialogical concept of democracy that this civilization is particularly well equipped to nurture and sustain. It is that dialogue today that has broken down. And I do believe that the responsibility partly lies in the knowledge sector. Thank you very much for your patience.